All right, Dr. Jeremy Porter from First Street Foundation. New report just came out. Everybody's kind of talking about Debby here over the past couple of weeks. We knew this was going to be a huge rainmaker and that flooding was going to be the biggest concern. So you guys came out with a report here recently. What did it say about the places that flooded in Debby?
Yeah, so we in sort of a quick turnaround, as soon as Debby passed, we went in and we collected all the rainfall information from the rain gauges, and using that information, we then reconstructed return periods using our own flood model and ran that through our flood model simulation. So ultimately, we were able to produce precipitation-based flooding from Debby, but then carry that through the larger simulation so that we were producing river flooding and interacting that river flooding in a lot of places with the high tides that occurred in some of the areas. What we saw was there were a handful of pockets of areas that were particularly hit hard by Debby. I mean, we saw the area right outside of Tampa, sort of the Sarasota area was impacted. There were some other things going on there around the tidal events, the rainfall runoff intersecting with that. There's a dam that ultimately released some floodwaters as well, which contributed to some of the flooding, but in Manatee County. But then we saw in northern Florida, just a little bit northeast of Gainesville, or a little northwest of Gainesville, an area that was hit really hard, about a 200-year return period rainfall event. And then again, when Debby made landfall around the Charleston, kind of South Carolina, Hilton Head area, we saw about a 200-year return period rainfall event there also. And in all those areas, we saw significant flooding. But overall, the thing that we took away from the event was that there were a number of properties that were impacted, but about 78% of those properties that were impacted fell outside of FEMA's special flood hazard area. And we know there's a few reasons for that. FEMA zones aren't designed to capture pluvial events and heavy rainfall events, and Debby was really a perfect example of the type of flooding that come from those types of events that oftentimes aren't captured by those flood zones.
Okay, that makes sense. Freshwater flooding. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like you mentioned Charleston, South Carolina. That's where I live. It's still happening. Like we get a heavy thunderstorm yesterday, and
Mm-hmm.
there's just nowhere for the water to go. So this river flooding is kind of an ongoing thing. So are you continuing to look at this over the coming weeks where this is going to be like a continual problem, the residual impacts here from Debby?
Yeah, that's a terrific point. I think in a lot of places, rivers don't even crest, right, until days, even a week after the heavy event occurs. And then as that continues to build upon itself from rainfall events, the water, to your point, doesn't have anywhere to go. And we end up seeing saturated soils don't absorb water in the same ways that soils do when they're not saturated. So we are planning to continue to follow it up. But at this point, we wanted to produce a sort of quick turnaround, kind of rapid response report that allows us to understand potential implications of Debby, especially given that it was a pluvial driven rainfall event. But then we are going to follow up as high water marks start to emerge, as we start to see rain flood grids emerge from other resources, primarily from the federal government. We'll start comparing our results to that and get a feel for what do we actually see in a wrap up as opposed to kind of a live kind of review of an event.
Okay, so explain to me, like, for people who don't fully understand how FEMA flood maps work, because it's
Mm-hmm.
confusing, what does it mean? Like, when you live in a flood zone, does that mean you have to have flood insurance? And then if you don't live in a flood zone, you don't have to have insurance? What's the purpose of them?
Yeah, and FEMA flood zones were created really as a way for emergency floodplain managers to sort of understand risk associated with flooding. They've been attached to the NFIP program, which started in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and this kind of kicked off. And in the absence of actual property-specific risk tools for flooding, FEMA flood zones have been used for that, but they weren't really ever designed to be property level risk analytic tools. But they are attached to the NFIP program. The NFIP program is where most of the country's flood insurance policies come from. I think even as far as a couple of years ago, it was as high as like 93, 94% of all flood policies come out of the NFIP program. So they're attached directly to these NFIP policies are attached directly to FEMA flood zones, or what we call special flood hazard areas, which are the 1 in 100 year zone that FEMA creates as its way of understanding significant flood risk. Through the development of those zones, the NFIP requires that any property that has a federally backed mortgage is required to have flood insurance if they fall within a FEMA flood zone. I think the problem that we've run into in our own research and that FEMA fully acknowledges, because it's not really in their purview to create flood maps this way, is that the flood maps don't capture small waterway flooding, things like streams, creeks, tributaries, those types of things, and they don't capture heavy precipitation flooding. They happen to be really good in coastal areas and on main river channels, and that's ultimately what they were initially designed to capture. So there is a little bit of a disjuncture in the ways in which they're being used currently and some of the risk we're seeing today from the changing climate.
Okay, so let's say you're in that 78% that was not in a flood zone and you flooded and you don't have flood insurance. What are your options? You just pay out of pocket? Does insurance cover anything at all, like homeowners insurance?
Homeowners insurance generally doesn't cover flooding, so it oftentimes will cover wind damage. Will be rolled into a homeowner's policy. If you're out west, wildfire will be rolled into a homeowner's policy. Flooding is unique in the insurance space in the sense that the federal government's always had, or at least since the 1960s, has had this federally funded insurance program through the NFIP that people would use if they had flood risk. If you're outside of the flood zones and you have damage, there's a very high likelihood that those properties don't have flood insurance. And for those properties, there may be some individual assistance monies coming from FEMA if they're following the disaster declaration, but it's not going to be enough to rebuild the damages that occurred from the event. So a lot of those properties are going to end up having to pay out of pocket and having to cover the damages themselves.
You mentioned some spots that got the heaviest rainfall. Are there any spots that you noticed in the report that are most vulnerable, the kind of surprise spots that maybe were hit especially hard, not necessarily with the most rain, but are most vulnerable to flooding, and then this issue of not being able to pay for their flood concerns to be
Yeah,
fixed?
absolutely. I think as through Florida, all throughout Florida, there's pretty good FEMA zone coverage in the area. I mean, the type of flooding that occurs in the state of Florida tends to be coastal storm surge flooding, so you end up getting pretty good coverage. So a lot of those properties were in fact inside of the FEMA zone, where we saw the big disjuncture between the risk for properties that were impacted and the FEMA zone coverage was as you started to move outside of the state. So in Georgia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, especially as you move away from the coast and you start to get into areas that traditionally we wouldn't think of as areas that flood. Those are precisely the kind of places that we're seeing more intense, more frequent, heavy downpour events, and precisely the kind of places that aren't tracked by FEMA zones. So those areas kind of popped out as areas where we saw a lot of damage, but there wasn't much in the way of NFIP coverage or properties in FEMA zones.
Okay, so this with all the reports you guys put out, identifies a problem. What's the goal of the report? How are you hoping this is going to be used?
Yeah, and we really produced it for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to show the skill of our own models against what we were seeing on the ground, and in a lot of ways, you can't really do that with probabilistic models. You have to have live events so that you can constantly be testing your models, improving your models, and that was one of the goals for us, was to be able to do that. But number two, we wanted to draw attention to the fact that there's a lot of properties that are at risk of flooding, and we've been doing this since we released our model back in 2020, but they don't have the adequate coverage for the flood risk that exists. And it's oftentimes not until you see an event like this that maybe doesn't fit the mold of a traditional hurricane with a lot of storm surge that floods coastal areas, that you start to look at it and you say, oh, the way we're thinking about flooding just doesn't fit anymore. There are a lot of properties that have risk. They're not being told they have risk because they're not in flood zones. Because they're not in flood zones, they also don't have insurance oftentimes, so they can't even protect their most valuable asset. So, there's a couple of points behind why we produced the reports, but one of the reasons was we wanted to highlight the fact that there are a lot of properties out there with significant flood risk that either don't know they have risk or aren't prepared for that risk.
Yeah, every time I talk to you, I feel like the kind of general theme is take responsibility for your own
Mm,
property, know what you're getting into, know what you own. So, how can we take that responsibility? How
yeah.
can we educate ourselves about where we live?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. That is our goal has always been to quantify and communicate flood risk at the asset level. We want people to understand their risk, to understand how they can protect themselves. We're getting better, and we have gotten better in even the last 5 years in terms of raising awareness around the issue and having more public-facing tools for people to understand that type of risk. But there's still just a tremendous amount of lack of understanding and awareness around that type of risk. So, at First Street, we built a tool that allows people to go on, type in their address. They can go on firststreet.org, type in an address. They can type in their community name. They can type in a zip code. You can actually go on and look at your risk. You can go in and understand what's my risk to flooding, what's my risk to wildfire, what's my risk to extreme wind, and understand what the damages are attached to that. So the first thing people can do is understand, their own risk. And then, we've also integrated this data into places like realtor.com, redfin.com. When you're seeing people use this information now and make climate informed decisions when they think about where to move, it's an interesting thing that's happening because people don't want to leave. If you live in Miami, you don't want to leave Miami, but maybe you don't want to move to where all the houses are scored nines and tens. Maybe you want to live where there are fives and sixes. If you lived in Minnesota, maybe a five and a six is too high, but it gives people at least another piece of information to make those decisions.